time to get started. I'd like to say welcome to everybody. We're going to be in Mark this morning. We're just going to be beginning in Mark. And if it looks like I put on a little weight, you can blame Nancy. Just blame Nancy. Just blame Nancy. That's who I'm blaming. So we'll just blame Nancy. So appreciate everybody being here this morning. Just a note for those of you who don't know, Melissa's mama passed away this morning, and so she's not here. But appreciate all the calls and the prayers and the thoughts, and we'll have more information about that later as far as this service and that kind of thing. But we're going to start on Mark, and we're going to start with the Bible Project video, and then I'll get back up and talk about the lesson. I don't know, I think it's about 10 minutes or so. They pack a lot of information into that little video, so I'm going to get away from the mic. I'm going to try to pick it up for the video or online folks. So we'll watch this video first.
The Gospel according to Mark is one of the first accounts of the life of Jesus, and our earliest historical traditions link this book to a Christian scribe named Mark, or John Mark. He was a co-worker with Paul and a close partner with Peter. And in fact, an ancient church historian named Papias, he recalls that Mark had collected all of the eyewitness accounts and memories of Peter and then shaped them into this account. But Mark didn't just randomly throw the pieces together. He's carefully designed this story of Jesus. In the first line of the book, Mark makes this claim about Jesus. It's the beginning of the good news about Jesus, the Messiah, the Son of God. Now what's interesting is that this is the only time Mark is going to tell you what he thinks. For the rest of the book, he's going to influence you by simply putting Jesus' actions and words in front of you and showing you how other people react to him. Now Mark's designed the story of Jesus as a drama with 3 acts. The first one set in Galilee, the third one is set in Jerusalem, and the second act shows Jesus on the way from one place to the other. And each of the acts focuses on a repeated theme. So in Act 1, everybody's blown away by Jesus, and they're wondering, who is this Jesus? In Act 2, it's the disciples who are struggling to understand what it means for Jesus to be the Messiah. And then in Act 3, we watch the surprising paradox of how Jesus becomes the Messianic king. Let's just dive in and you'll see how it unfolds. After the opening line, Mark begins with a quotation from the ancient prophets Isaiah and Malachi, who said that God would send a messenger to Israel to prepare them for when God would show up himself to rescue his people and become their king. And Mark introduces John the Baptist as that messenger, and then right when you expect God to show up personally, Mark introduces Jesus. And as he comes onto the scene, the heavens open, God's Spirit descends on Jesus, and God says, "You are my beloved Son." After this, Mark places in front of us a summary of Jesus' core message. He went about Galilee announcing the good news that God's kingdom has come near. Jesus is carrying forward the story from the Old Testament scriptures about God's rescue operation for his world. Through Jesus, God is restoring his reign over the world by confronting and defeating evil and its hold on people's lives. And then by inviting them to live under his reign by following Jesus. From here, Mark's given us a big block of stories showing us Jesus' power as he brings God's kingdom. He goes about healing people whose bodies are sick or broken or under the oppression of dark spiritual powers. And Jesus even does something that for Jewish people only God has the right to do. He forgives people's sins. And Jesus' actions here produce lots of different responses. So some people follow him and become his disciples. Other people don't know what to think, and still others reject him completely, especially Israel's leaders who accuse him of blaspheming God and being empowered by evil. But Jesus isn't surprised by these responses. In fact, he draws attention to it. In chapter 4, Mark has collected many of Jesus' parables about the hidden, mysterious nature of God's kingdom. And Jesus says that his message is like seed falling on different types of soil. Some are receptive, some are not. Or it's like a mustard seed that's very tiny. It seems insignificant, but then it grows huge and surprises everyone. Jesus' point is that he really is the Messiah, bringing God's kingdom, but it doesn't look like what anybody expected. And this growing confusion about Jesus among the crowds is connected to a key idea Mark emphasizes at the end of Act 1, that even among Jesus' disciples there's confusion. Even they are struggling to grasp who Jesus really is, and that brings us to Act 2. It begins with a crucial conversation. Jesus takes the disciples aside and he asks, "Who do you all say that I am?" And Peter speaks up, saying, "You're the Messiah." But it becomes clear that for Peter this means that Jesus is a victorious military king from the line of David who will rescue Israel from the Romans. But for Jesus to be the Messiah means that he's the suffering servant king of Isaiah 53, who will bring God's rule by giving up his life in Jerusalem. And the disciples, they don't get it. They think following King Jesus is going to mean fame and status and importance, and Jesus makes it clear that following him is actually like dying, like carrying your own cross. It means rejecting violence and pride and selfishness and giving one's life out for others in acts of service and love. He has the same conversation with them 2 more times, and it all culminates in Jesus' important statement that the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to become a servant and give his life as a ransom for many. The disciples still don't get it. They respond in confusion and fear. And so here in Act 2, Mark has placed another key story that echoes the book's introduction. Jesus takes 3 of his disciples up to a mountain, and he's suddenly transformed. He's radiating with light and glory, and a cloud envelops them. Now, this is just like the glory of the God of Israel that showed up long ago on Mount Sinai. And then the 2 prophets who stood in God's presence on Mount Sinai, Moses and Elijah, they appear next to Jesus as God announces again, "This is my beloved Son." Now, by placing this story in the middle of all of these conversations in Act 2, Mark is making an astounding claim that Jesus, God's Son, is the physical embodiment of God's own glory. And in Jesus, the glorious God of Israel is going to become king by suffering and dying for the sins of his own people. It's a puzzling claim that confuses and scares the disciples as they leave the mountain. Which brings us to Act 3. Jesus makes a very public royal entry into Jerusalem for Passover. People are hailing him as the Messiah. Then he enters into the temple courtyard and he asserts his royal authority by running out the thieves and crooks and stopping the sacrificial system. Then this kicks off a whole week of Jesus debating and confronting the leaders of Israel, condemning their hypocrisy, and so they set in motion a plan to have him killed. And Jesus warns his disciples, predicting that Jerusalem and its temple will be destroyed within a generation, and his disciples will be persecuted just like him, until he returns one day to bring God's kingdom fully over the world. And it all leads up to the final night. Jesus has his last Passover meal with the disciples, a symbolic meal that told the story of Israel's liberation from slavery through the death of the Passover lamb. And Jesus takes these symbols and he gives them new meaning. They point to the liberation from sin and death that will happen through the death of the suffering servant Messiah. From here, the story rushes forward to Jesus' arrest, his trial before Israel's priests and the Roman governor Pilate, all resulting in Jesus' crucifixion. And it culminates in a key scene that matches the important scenes from Acts 1 and 2. Except this time, it's darkness that descends, not a cloud. And instead of the divine voice from heaven, it's Jesus' voice crying out before he dies. And then most surprising is that it's a Roman soldier who sees Jesus die, who grasps and then announces who Jesus is. This man was the Son of God. He's the first person in the story to recognize the story's shocking claim about Jesus' identity, that it's the crucified Son of God who's the Messiah, Jesus of Nazareth, who died for his friends and for his enemies. After this, Jesus' body is placed in a tomb, and on the first day of the new week, 2 women from his disciples come to the tomb, and they discover that the tomb is empty, the stone's rolled away. And an angelic man informs them that Jesus isn't here, that he's risen from the dead. And so he orders them to go and tell this good news to the other disciples, that Jesus is alive, that he'll meet them back up in Galilee. And the women, they're freaked out. Mark says that they fled from the tomb in terror, telling no one, for they were afraid. And that's how the book ends, with Jesus' disciples showing the same kind of fear and confusion that concluded Acts 2 and 1. Now, if you look in your Bible, you'll see that the Gospel of Mark has more to its ending, where Jesus appears, he speaks to his disciples, But there's also a note there telling you that that ending is not part of the original book, that it's only found in later, less reliable manuscripts. Now, it's possible that the original ending got lost, or that Mark actually never finished writing his account, but it's more likely that this abrupt ending is intentional to make a point. The entire story has focused on the shocking claim that puzzled Jesus' disciples from beginning to end, that it's the suffering, crucified, and risen Jesus who's the Messiah, the Son of God. That God's love and upside-down kingdom were revealed as Jesus died for the sins of the world. And so this story ends without closure, and it forces you, the reader, to grapple with this very strange and scandalous claim about Jesus. And are you going to run away like the disciples? Or are you going to recognize Jesus as your king and go and tell the good news? And only you can answer that question. And that's what the Gospel of Mark is all about.
All right, so next week we'll start on something else because we got it all right there. Man, that was screaming a lot during that video, by the way. We just all were just polite enough not to say anything. Let's see if I can get this on there where you can hear me. All right. Well, my hat's off to those guys at the Bible Project. They can really pack a lot of information into one video, and I really like it. A lot of people don't learn like that, and that's fine. But I really like the way that works. We're supposed to get through all. He got through all that in 10 minutes, and we're supposed to get all through that in I don't know how many weeks. I didn't count the weeks, but I can assure you that we won't get through it in that amount of time. And so. As I was doing this study, it was interesting to me because there's a lot of things that I never had thought about, and we're going to talk about those. And I just want to preface it by saying that, so I won't get to that. I'll bring that up. But we've all had someone say to us, well, this is the good news or the bad news, or I have good news or bad news. And Mark just starts with the good news. I have good news. That's the beginning. And it's important to note that what Mark has to say is good news. The news about Jesus isn't bad. It's not a tragedy. It's basically an announcement of a major success. Okay? Think of it that way. It's an announcement of a major success Mark is bringing to us. The beginning of the gospel is right there. This is the beginning of the gospel. Now, Matthew starts with the genealogy. We know that. All the things leading up to Jesus. Luke starts with John and Jesus' births, and John talks about Jesus as the eternal Word and the beginning. Mark starts with this is the beginning of everything, the beginning of the gospel, and that, like the video said, it's the fulfillment of God's Word, God's promise. And so it's going to explain who Jesus is, why Jesus came to earth, what does it mean to follow him. But when Mark is talking to us, and I'm just going to say it like that, we look at the Gospels as a story, and we find differences in the stories of the different Gospels. And so what I'd like to do is just set Mark apart, and we're just going to talk about Mark, not how it pertains to Matthew and Luke and John. We're just going to talk about Mark in and of itself, because there's a distinct purpose for each of the Gospels. If we read Mark independently from all the other Gospels, his story is complete in and of itself, and we don't have to add to Mark's story scenes from Matthew or how Matthew saw that story. And so if we read an episode of what's going on in Mark, and we push in details about what was going on in Matthew, we lose what Mark is looking at. You know, we lose his vision in the details that are about the going on. So we changed, you know, we basically changed the story, and we do that. We do that a lot. But as we focus on Mark, we're going to study this gospel. We're going to see what it says about itself, and where it begins and how it goes. And we're going to get, this is just the introduction, so we're going to get through the first couple of verses, and that's going to be it. So, the beginning of the book, it says this is the beginning of the gospel. It's the start. So what does that mean? What does that mean to those that heard that word? Now, we have something that we have something in our mind. When we hear gospel, okay, we know the definition of gospel is good news, and it always, and I'm going to say, to me, it always had a biblical connotation of the gospel that the picture that you get when I say gospel, you know what I'm talking about. It wasn't a new word, okay? The term gospel is never a reference to the scriptures in the scriptures, okay? And so the gospel is the message of salvation, right? But it's so much more than that. It's a message, and the message that we can boil down is that God is in charge. God reigns, and his reign is on earth. So in Isaiah it says, how beautiful upon the mountains are the feet of him who brings good news, the gospel, who publishes peace, who brings good news of happiness, who publishes salvation, who say to Zion, God reigns. So Isaiah says the good news is not just a message of salvation, the picture that we have, but also a declaration of God's reign, God's power. In Isaiah 40, go up on the mountain, O Zion, the herald of good news. Lift up your voice with strength, O Israel, herald of good news. Lift it up. Say to the cities of Judah, behold your God. Behold, the Lord God comes with might, and his arm rules for him. Behold, his reward is with him, and this recompense is before him. So that good news is the arrival of God. Okay? And we read in Mark about the arrival of Christ. And so it's the arrival, coming in strength to reward those and to punish those that are against him. So that good news, that gospel, is a message of enthronement and, exalting the king and those that kind of connotation and the rightful place of the king on the throne and that whole idea. So this is the part I didn't know. You study things for some things and you find out other things that you just didn't know. I don't know why I didn't know, why I've never heard this before. I'm going to blame all my teachers up until this point. That's who I'm going to blame. Why don't I know this? Okay? Because this is how the Greco-Roman era, the world in Rome, used the word gospel. So they used the word gospel. It proclaimed news of victory from the battlefield. It was used to announce the emperor's accession to the throne. Caesar Augustus declared that he brought good news, the gospel, to the world by making war cease and creating order. And the beginning of that good news was the birth of Augustus, calling him a god and proclaiming him to have a universal impact on what's going on in the world. So Mark opens up with this wording, the beginning of the gospel. But it's not about Caesar, it's about Jesus, the Son of God. So one of the things that Mark emphasizes as the gospel is God establishing his rule over creation. The rule of God has arrived. The good news is that God and his rule has arrived. It's his rule over Israel, the rule over all nations, the rule over the Roman Empire, over nature, over all creation and all people. This is that time. This is that announcement. This is that proclamation of the good news. God reigns, and God is in charge. And so, it doesn't end there. So, I thought this was interesting too, and I don't know why I don't know this. But, we read a lot about, we read a lot in the scriptures as it is written. Okay, as it is written. We read that a lot. It doesn't typically begin a sentence. This is the beginning of the good news of Jesus as it is written. But it doesn't always stop there. It's as it is written in the words of the prophet Isaiah. Okay? And so the group that Mark is I'm going to say talking to or writing to or referencing would know that as it was written by Isaiah, the prophet. So Isaiah is right where Mark starts. Gospel of Mark as a whole, if you look through, is basically the gospel according to Isaiah. It's the beginning of the gospel that Isaiah spoke about. So Isaiah is the key to understanding a lot of the nuances of Mark. So it's the only place in the whole gospel where the author, Mark, tells the reader that the scripture is fulfilled. Okay? So Mark is telling us that this is the fulfillment of Isaiah's prophecy. Okay? And so we have to look at it, or we're going to look at it, through Isaiah, who proclaimed the coming of the new Exodus, the restoration, the new creation, and the return to God. And God is going to reign. And so all of these things we can picture in our minds about what's going on with Christ in his time on earth, and they correlate with what Isaiah prophesied before. So Isaiah is the prophet that connected to the Messianic time. So he was a prophet, and then the Messiah came. And so the beginning of hope for the end of the exile, as God will return and restore Israel, and this happens through Christ. If we read Mark by itself, not as another gospel, but just as an account, we're going to read that his gospel is the beginning of the good news that Isaiah wrote about, and how it unfolds through the story of Christ. And so, now Mark quotes the prophets a lot, and he does that to show what's coming, because the gospel is now beginning. We started that at the very first. This is the beginning. It's a combination of three scriptures that Mark quotes in Exodus 23, Malachi 3, and Isaiah 40, and verse 2 from Exodus 23. But combining prophecies was not an uncommon practice. I didn't know that. I must be a poor student. That must be the problem. I was just a poor student, because all of these things came. And why does that matter? I don't know that it would have any effect on my study at any point, or any tidbit of knowledge that I might carry with me, but it's very interesting that they were combining these prophecies because they were interrelated. So we talk about these three texts. Let's see what you're going to talk about. Let's just see what they teach us about Jesus. So in Exodus 23, behold, I send an angel before you to guard you on the way and bring you to the place that I have prepared. Okay? God's making a promise to Israel on Mount Sinai, and the promise is God is going to send a messenger. Does that sound familiar? God is going to send a messenger, and we learned in Mark. John is the messenger. If the people obey God's voice and not rebel, God will destroy their enemies, give the land as promised to the people, and bless them richly.
This was the hope given to the people of Israel. They failed on their end. Because we learn in the scriptures the people didn't do that. They didn't obey God's voice. They did rebel. So take everything that God told them to do, and that's the opposite of what they did do. And the promises weren't given and were not fulfilled. But Malachi, and I think this is where they connect, Malachi shows that those promises did not die with Israel's failure. Okay? The promises were still in place. Although Israel failed on their side of the bargain, the promise still stood if their behavior turned and matched what the promise was given for. So, behold, I send a messenger, and he will prepare the way before me. And the Lord whom you seek will suddenly come to his temple. And the messenger of the covenant in whom you delight, behold, he's coming, says the Lord of hosts. But who can endure the day of his coming, and who can stand when he appears? For he's like a refiner's fire and like a fuller's soap. He will sit as a refiner and purifier of silver. He will purify the sons of Levi and refine them like gold and silver, and they'll bring offerings in righteousness to the Lord. Then the offering of Judah and Jerusalem will be pleasing to the Lord in the last days of old, as it was in the former years. So Malachi, this is a quote from in Exodus, and then he puts a little spin on it to say that it's still in effect. So Malachi's message is that the people have failed. However, God is sending a messenger. This messenger is going to prepare the way. He's going to prepare the way for God's arrival. And the Lord whom you seek will suddenly come to the temple. That's in 3:1. But when the Lord comes, it's going to be a time of purification and refining. Okay, that's the part that you kind of like to skip over. You don't like the bad part, because purification and refining requires punishment. You can talk to Kevin Donahue about that when he forges a knife. There's a lot of punishment. That metal goes through a lot of punishment before it comes out the other end as what was expected. Okay? And so God's going to come and purify the people. So the messenger's coming to get the people ready for the arrival of the Lord. Okay? And we know, when I say messenger, we know it's John the Baptist. And in Isaiah, and this is going to sound familiar, but in Isaiah 40, a voice cries, "In the wilderness, prepare the way of the Lord. Make straight in the desert a highway for our God." And so, in the first couple verses of Mark, this quote from Isaiah is a message of hope. It's a message of comfort, as opposed to the message of pain and discomfort from the purification process. But the wrath of God has ended and sins have been paid for. So then the voice crying in the wilderness, why is the cry from the wilderness? And this is another thing I didn't think about. Another focus that I had one of those. I don't know how to explain it. And it's the things, it's interesting to me when I learn something because I wish I'd known it before. There's a lot of those kind of things. And then I wonder, how come I haven't known that before? But we know the cry is from the wilderness. We know John was in the wilderness. He ate honey and locusts and wore camel hair and a leather belt and all of those kind of things that we can visualize in our minds. But why the wilderness? Well, why not the city? Why not from the city? Why can't you start in the city or somewhere like Jerusalem or somewhere else? Well, the wilderness is considered the staging ground for God's future victory. Okay? All of God's beginnings in the life of his people were in the wilderness. The promises made were in the wilderness. The wilderness was where all the promises of the promised land were made. Israel believed there would be a return to the wilderness, and a second Exodus would herald this coming of the Messiah, the Messianic age, or that time period, and that's kind of what we're getting here. Israel became a nation in the wilderness. Redemption began in the wilderness. They became a new people and a new nation under Moses and Joshua in the wilderness. So a voice is going to cry out in the wilderness, and that will bring forth or initiate this new Exodus, a new people of God. And here we are. New era of salvation and restoration for God's people, just like Isaiah had talked about. They're going to become a new people whose identity will be centered on Jesus. Okay? And so they will be God's people. We will all be God's people. And then, of course, the prepare the way for the Lord, make straight the paths for Him. The Lord is coming, and the roads need to be paved. Get the roads ready. I don't know if you've ever been in. We've been around. Most of you have been around here long enough to know when the president came to Northwest Arkansas. I'm talking about Bill Clinton, but because this is the one I have familiarity with. But there's a lot of preparation that goes into when the president comes to town. And I had I graduated with a friend of mine that was on the Secret Service advance team. Okay, and so and he came by where I was working, and we visited about, and he was there weeks ahead of time. All the things that have to be prepared, all the things that have to be set in place, all the things that have to be cleared, and and then of course when the president gets here, there's the roads that are blocked, and everything is set to make his way clear. Okay, that's kind of the connotation we're getting here. Make it ready. The Lord's coming. You need to be ready. Get the roads ready. Be prepared for His arrival. And of course, we've seen, I guess, movies or have an idea that when the King comes and the crowds line the streets to watch the entrance of the King into the city, that's kind of what we're talking about here. And so what's the message in the opening lines of Mark's gospel? What's the message that we get from Exodus 23? This is the message. Pay careful attention to Him and obey His voice. Do not rebel against Him, for He will not pardon your transgressions, for my name is in Him. And that's from Exodus. The message in Malachi, just as clear. But who can endure the day of the coming, and who can stand when He appears? For He's like a refiner's fire, like a fuller's soap. Israel's disobedience affected their relationship with God. That hasn't changed. In the wilderness, prepare the way for the Lord, make straight the desert, the highway for our God. Be ready. And that's the call. Be ready. Prepare. The gospel message is God is coming. God reigns. And there's something we need to do in response to His coming and His kingship that we can't turn aside from, that we can't rebel from, that we can't change to our liking, that we can't define in our way to make it fit our idea. Make the way straight. Okay? We have to be ready to pay careful attention. We have to be ready to be refined. So, that kind of makes us think about what does it take to follow Jesus? What is our responsibility to be a disciple of Christ? What is our mindset on how to walk with God, how to walk in the way of the Lord, how to not turn, how to not rebel, how to not forget. What is our responsibility, and how do we maintain and not turn from and not shirk that responsibility? How do we do that? Well, we're doing it right now. Okay, that's what we're doing. We're in anti-shirk mode right now. We're trying not to shirk the responsibilities that God has placed on us to be His people, to be His followers, and to understand God reigns. And so we have to make the way straight. So, in order for us as God's people to experience all that God has to offer, you can kind of follow the pattern of what was going on when the king is coming into town. Okay, we have to go out to Jesus. Okay, Jesus is there. We just have to go out to Him. We got to get behind Him. We have to follow Him on the road He walked. We have to realize He is the anointed one. He is the King. He is the Messiah, the King of Kings, the Son of God. And we have to remember that His arrival was the beginning of the gospel, the beginning of the good news that God had laid the foundation for from the beginning of time. It was written by Isaiah. It offers hope to all that come to Him and follow Him. And there's just so much more to the definition of the gospel. Okay? And so I'm going to make it a point in my life to not limit. I'm not going to limit the definition in my life of the gospel, what that means. God is here. God is reigning. God is with His people. God is king. And, salvation only comes through Him. And so that's where we are as we start in Mark. We're going to try to get to all of that. We're not going to. We just, and I'm going to blame Keith because Keith is helping me still. And so I'm going to do chapters 1 and 2, so you can get ready with chapter 3. It'll be a couple weeks out, but it'll be more than a couple weeks out. Because, several months probably. Because there's just so much. I mean, we could read it, and we could go through it just as fast as they did on the Bible Project, but then we'll miss out on why we don't know. Why we don't know the wilderness actually means something, in the Scriptures. Why we don't know the things that we don't know. And we find those things that we don't know as we search the Scriptures. And, our reactions may differ as to what we learn and what we find that we know. But that's the beginning of Mark. Next week we'll delve into more of what's going on as far as the stories go. But again, I want us, as we study, that's second bell? First bell? First bell? Yeah, I'm done anyway, so we'll just visit a little bit. But I want us to try, as we read through the stories that seem familiar to us from the other Gospels, and that are familiar to us from the other Gospels, but look at it from just Mark's experience and his point of view, the time he spent with Peter and Paul, and who he's talking to, and those kind of things, so that we can just glean a little bit more from it than just, Mark's a gospel, and we know the stories, and that's how that goes. So anyway, thanks so much for your attention, and I'll see you next week, and we'll delve into